All right, guys. Good morning or good afternoon, and I guess this is our first lecture video for time period two. Remember, that's 1607 to 1754, and we are starting early on. Okay, we're going to be talking about colonial America, the early colonies, and really what I'm titling this is early cultural regions. So we break that down into New England, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies, moving north to south. There are three types of colonies that you should be familiar with, right? Charter, proprietary, and royal colonies. We're also going to get into some squatter colonies today, colonies that aren't actually colonies. They end up becoming colonies. We're talking about colonies like Rhode Island and Georgia. Georgia was a debtor's colony. Rhode Island was more appropriately a squatter's colony. Delaware was broken off of Pennsylvania. So there is a little bit of nuance here, but there are essentially three major types of colonies. And one of the most important ones is the charter colonies. Remember, we talked about the difference between the Spanish exploration and English colonization, and gold turned from more literal to figurative with the arrival of the English. These journeys across the Atlantic, and as we know when we look at the story of Jamestown, were very difficult to make and then to succeed. And the charter colony helps to disperse the risk and the expense of founding and funding a journey and a voyage and the establishment of a colony. So a charter colony um, really is kind of like a business venture. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. We're going to start talking the southern colonies. For this lecture, we'll move from south to north. The southern colonies are Maryland, Virginia, Carolina, and Georgia. Of course, there was just one Carolina originally. Let's start with Maryland because we are Catholic school students. Maryland was founded 1634. It's a proprietary colony by Lord Baltimore, and it was established essentially for Catholics to become a Catholic colony. Um, a lot of Protestants move in, of course, and they are welcomed. Um, the colonists that moved to Maryland, just like in Virginia with Jamestown and the House of Burgesses, are promised a share in the government. So I want you to think real quickly, if we're going to talk a little bit about thinking critically about the difference, right, between some of these uh, Englishmen, be they making the journey on their own entirely or indentured servants, come with a lot more promise of freedom than the other major population immigrating into the United States, or what will become the United States during this time period, and that, of course, is the slaves, the African slaves in the triangular trade. Um, in any case, Maryland establishes the Act of Toleration is something we need to know. 1649 provides freedom of religion for all Christians. Okay, it actually denies it to others. And while it applies to all Christians, as I said early, Maryland is intended to be a Catholic colony, and the Act of Toleration is really written to welcome Catholics. Okay, it's or to protect Catholicism, because as we'll see, the rest of the colonies are really more of an Anglican type nature or Puritan in sections certainly of New England. Maryland is a little bit unique there. As far as Carolina goes, all right, the original singular Carolina. Um, so a couple things to point out. There is a big difference in kind of who populates the Carolina region from the north to the south. In what eventually becomes South Carolina, where Charlestown is, or Charleston, it's very heavy on commerce, trade, very aristocratic. South Carolina, believe it or not, actually is the wealthy Carolina. And North Carolina is mainly small farmers. There's no aristocracy. Very little in the way of slaveholding in North Carolina, originally at least, because the population filling North Carolina, as it were, wasn't wealthy enough to own that many slaves. The aristocrats, okay, are in South Carolina. Um, in fact, in certain areas of North Carolina, you have a lot of squatters sitting on land. They actually didn't own the land, but they operate their farms, largely subsistence farming and into some trade farming as well, as those economies began to flourish, as those crops that we'll talk about today began to flourish. Um, and South Carolina, again, the aristocracy, and you can imagine that that there's probably been some impact of uh, this founding period on um, the cultures of North and South Carolina. I want you to think about South Carolina because now, like, we've got the spoiler alert, right, with what happens in American history. South Carolina, being a much larger slaveholding state and aristocratic and wealthy, really becomes the state more than any other that later will lead the charge for well, ultimately secession, and prior to that, nullification. Anything that South Carolina doesn't like that the federal government would seem to do to impede upon their states' rights, you're going to hear a lot from South Carolina. And I just want you to consider maybe how the early roots maybe contribute to what we will later see in history. Georgia, as I mentioned earlier, um, is a debtor's colony, primarily founded to be like a buffer between Spanish Florida and these English colonies being established. Savannah is the oldest city, the chief settlement, and if anyone's been to Savannah, it's got tremendous history. Um, but it's also founded as a debtor's colony, as I said, where people who owed others money can find a home, essentially. Okay, they owe aristocrats money, and they have an opportunity in Georgia to work through that and to live a life that's intended to be at least prosperous, right? Um, so this is a full, 1733. So we're already towards the end of the time period here for the purposes of this lecture, but founded by James Oglethorpe, an Enlightenment era thinker. And the Enlightenment era, if you studied world history, you know what that is. But that is something we're going to talk about later on as well when we get into the foundations, the founding principles of American government. I do love to point out the quote at the bottom of the screen here, where James Oglethorpe goes on to say what Georgia is intended to be. And if you read the quote there, essentially, um, what they end up being is poor, bad manners, kind of. Oglethorpe has some negative feelings about the people who end up inhabiting Georgia. So if you have a friend from Georgia, you can always bust their chops and remind them they were originally a colony of dirty debtors and squatters. All in all, though, one of the really important takeaways here is that South becomes what we'll call the plantation colonies: Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. Right. So tobacco originally, and we talked about that with the establishment of Jamestown. Okay, um, requires a vast amount of space. That particular crop really exhausts the soil. And in order to be fruitful and profitable in tobacco planting, you need vast expanses of land and you need a labor source. Cotton works much the same way. It's a very labor intensive crop to grow and to make product out of, rather than just the actual plant, but to remove the cotton, to pick the cotton. Okay, um, and primarily in Georgia and North Carolina, you're going to see those poor people that don't have the opportunity to own slaves. But certainly in Virginia, in South Carolina, This will lead to a slave-based economy based upon the need of that land and the need for labor. Okay, um, and early on, I think what we're going to see is that there is a really big impact on the culture and the economies of early colonial regions based simply on nothing more than physical geography. In order for the southern colonies to survive, plantation crops needed to thrive. And for that to happen, especially in the areas with the aristocrats, that kind of necessitated in this day and age a slave based economy um, to make it through the 17th century in large part. Certainly, it's not a justification for slavery, and you can imagine some ways in which these colonies could have gone elsewhere, but this was the easy way. This was the easy way out, and it really is based upon the physical geography, the climate, because we're not going to see the same physical geographic effect in New England, right, where the soil is rocky and uh, we have some other elements going into culture there, but you just see much less slaves up north. So this idea that, hey, another spoiler alert, we know how this book ends, and the United States is going, what will become the United States is eventually going to have this brief split, right, with the Civil War. Well, you can almost see the writing on the wall just due to physical geographic factors and their impact upon local economies. Okay. The middle colonies, so we talked about the South, I already kind of name dropped the North. The middle colonies we'll know modern day as, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Um, and then we'll get into, as the bottom of this slide suggests, the New England Confederation and the Dominion of New England. Perhaps most notably, of course, is New York, which opened up in 1609 with Henry Hudson, the Hudson River, okay, exploring around Manhattan. And the Dutch West India Company comes into New York. They name it New Amsterdam. The Swedes had attempted to colonize this area as well along the Delaware River, which is further to the west. Delaware River is currently the border between New Jersey and Pennsylvania, but also flows um, towards about like Philadelphia area. Um, New York will fall to the Dutch and become primarily a Dutch colony. The English and the Dutch have a tremendous rivalry, and there's significant competition for this land. There's a series of wars that ends in the 1660s, and the English fleet essentially takes over the lower tip of what is Manhattan, and the city is renamed New York, and the rest is history, including, God bless you, Mark Messier and the 94 New York Rangers. Don't need to talk a lot, to be honest, about the colonial history of New Jersey, but like, I'm a Jersey guy. I couldn't just leave it out. And so here is a picture of Bruce Springsteen. He's a god. Let's move on. I mean, you guys just got Messier and Springsteen. This is like a window into my soul. Pennsylvania is a little unique among the middle colonies. It's, as you know by now, I'm sure, is a Quaker colony. Quakers are a unique bunch. They are a very democratic Protestant group. In fact, there were no like preachers in the Quaker religion. It was kind of whoever felt the spirit was invited to speak and deliver their heart in in speech to the congregation. There was no church government. They are largely known for being pacifists, for not engaging in violence. So the English clearly have as you can probably surmise based upon our reading and some of the conversations we at least have hinted at, the English have an entirely different culture, and a lot of Quakers are treated poorly in different areas. But William Penn settles a debt with King Charles and is given the land that would make up the vast majority of Pennsylvania. It expands further west later. Um, But Philadelphia itself ends up becoming one of the chief major cities of the colonial America. It's probably the most cosmopolitan, culturally significant city in the colonies, even more so than Boston. Um, William Penn, as a Quaker, is notable and unique for his treatment of Native Americans. He actually treated the Native Americans very well. This was in his ethos, right? As a Quaker, he paid them for their lands. There were no major conflicts, and we'll see that's obviously not going to be the case with other regions and other colonies and other leaders, but there were no major conflicts between the Indians and the Quakers of Pennsylvania. Um, Penn actually goes on to allow colonies, or counties, I should say, within Pennsylvania to form their own colony. Again, this is kind of in the ethos of being a Quaker, and thus we have 1703, the forming of the colony of Delaware. Okay, so now we're getting up north. New England, the Dominion of New England. Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, and here we will see probably the most significant conflicts with Native Americans. I will be talking a little bit more about one other potential candidate for that title. And we're going to spend some time with that particular incident later. We'll call that Bacon's Rebellion, but that's going to be out of the Chesapeake, which is like Maryland, Delaware, and Northeast Virginia. So we'll get that later. Let's talk about New England, okay? We go back to the Protestant Reformation. The population that wants to purify the Church of England, okay, are known as Puritans. And they, a lot of them are known then as separatists, right? And I think you've seen both of those terms. They want to break away from the Church of England entirely and form their own kind of pure, very rigid, uh, religiously based culture. It is going to be those separatist Puritans that become the largest demographic to populate New England. So here we see a map of the first New England colonies, including Massachusetts, 1630, okay, Rhode Island, 1644, and earliest Plymouth colony, which lasted from 1620 to 1691, and we'll talk about its merger later. But let's open up with the Plymouth colony. Again, founded by separatist Puritans in 1620, and what's incredibly, I think, notable about them, by the way, like many sailors, they were lost. They were looking for New York because it doesn't want to be New York, you know what I'm saying? But one of the most notable things about the separatist Puritans in Plymouth colony is the establishment of the Mayflower Compact, an agreement that sets up a temporary government. But it's notable what this temporary government is. This is pure, straight up, old fashioned, inefficient democracy. Okay. Um, and so we think about why, right? Well, the Puritans, this is kind of the story that we're often told about, you know, the freedom of religion trope in American history. Well, this is it, right? That those separatist Puritans of Plymouth um, broke away and wanted to break away. They wanted to separate from the Anglican Church, the Church of England, and they want to get out from under the thumb of that control, the control from the English throne, as well as the church itself. And so, in establishing how they are going to govern themselves, um, they go with pure democracy. Now, when we talked about physical geography, this plays a role as well. So let's imagine, right, that every time a decision needs to be made for a town, a village, a county, for the colony, they actually vote on that decision. They need to come together, discuss it, maybe lobby one another, and actually have a vote. And the popular will carry the day. Um, it's really important to notice that the Mayflower Compact, 1620, and prior to that, we had already talked about the Virginia House of Burgesses, which I told you was actually the first representative democracy or democratic body in the United States. So it's actually, a year earlier, but 700 miles away, is an evolutionary step beyond what is essentially direct democracy in the Mayflower Compact. Regardless, why would they establish that? Well, again, they wanted to break away from control, and you can imagine that if they're on the Mayflower and they're about to land, and they say, "Hey, how are we going to govern ourselves?" and someone's like, "I got you. I'm gonna run this show." They'd probably be tossed overboard. They weren't looking for anything that could possibly even resemble tyranny, right? But so here in the new land, between the Virginia House of Burgesses and the Mayflower Compact, you have these seeds of independence, democracy, um, the Puritans, the Quakers. You have a breaking away. And as we talked about the Enlightenment era, you have some influence that, if you know the ending, right, and the Declaration of Independence to follow down, 150 years from now, um, you would see kind of again the writing on the wall. The Plymouth colony merges with Massachusetts Bay in 1691. But this is this classic American story that you are familiar with. But we want to paint it a little bit differently and understand what seeds are being planted. Okay. Um, the term Great Migration is really important to recognize here. That's this mass movement of these Puritans that arrive into the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which is just north of the Plymouth Colony. We saw it on the map earlier. Okay, that's called the Great Migration. And so you can imagine the common cultural influences between the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Plymouth Colony, and ultimately it would make sense that with such commonalities between them that we would have one colony. And the Massachusetts Bay Colony becomes the most significant colony, of course, home to Boston. Um, John Winthrop, okay, is the governor, and he is famous for his dubbing of Boston or Massachusetts Bay as the city upon a hill. So early on, I think Massachusetts understands their significance in this establishment of this new world, and ultimately, they, along with Philadelphia, right, are going to play a major role towards again, we know the ending. We know what's going to happen. So towards the eventual, right, gradual separation into an independent nation. Rhode Island is an interesting one. Rhode Island is founded by a guy by the name of Roger Williams, who was expelled from Massachusetts colony because he had spoken out against the government punishing religious dissent. And he doesn't think that the government has a right to confiscate Indian land. And he's tossed out of Massachusetts Bay Colony for those beliefs. So, as much as we're talking about like the establishment of democratic ideals, you'll see here, especially when it comes to the Puritan church, right? The separatist Puritan church, there's very little room for dissent. And notably, is Roger Williams' feelings about Indians and their, I guess, their God-given rights, and that the Puritan Church is stepping on them. So Roger Williams, tossed out of the colony, he forms the colony of Rhode Island. This is, as I said earlier, is originally a squatter colony. Okay. It was a squatter colony essentially from like I think 1635, 1636 to it becomes recognized as a colony um, with a charter from Parliament in 1644. And again, Rhode Island is unique because there is absolute religious freedom for Quakers, Jews, Christians, Catholics. There's no mandated religious attendance. There's no state sanctioned church. There's wide access to economic opportunity. So Rhode Island is a little bit of an outlier as it pertains to the rest of the New England region, where religion is huge. Okay, it plays a huge role in the government. Don't get it twisted about any ideas about separation of church and state when we're talking about, early colonial regions and early colonial America. Um, Religion is dominant. Religious life is dominant. Um, Taxes go to support the church. Laws require church attendance. You see, Roger Williams gets away from this kind of stuff, right, with the establishment of Rhode Island. We see another dissenter tossed, right, and that is Anne Hutchison. Um, Anne Hutchison challenges some of the Puritan beliefs. She challenges the notion that when I said we have, again, these democratic ideals, there's no women voting. And so Anne Hutchinson speaks up about this. She could be, I guess, said Anne Hutchinson is the first women's rights. She's the first feminist in the New World. Okay. And so what does she get for it? Well, she gets thrown on trial and she gets thrown out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, um, along with Roger Williams. And where does she go? Naturally, she goes to Rhode Island. There's a really good essay we're going to take a look at about how the Puritans dealt and felt about dissent with the case of Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. We'll turn our attention to that in a couple minutes. In the meantime, of course, one of the major themes we need to talk about is the conflict, right, between settlers and natives. Now, it's very true that early on, some of the Native Americans actually help the early settlers, teach them. This is again a difficult journey and a difficult establishment to form in a whole new world, different soil, different crops, different climate. And so there's absolutely some of the fairy tale is true about Native Americans helping the early settlers. But that doesn't last very long. Um, Tensions really rise between these populations. And what I find interesting is here's as far as the thinking went among the English of New England. When there is continual conflict between the settlers and the natives, the question is, okay, so what do we do? How do we Christianize them? Do we displace them, move them? Do we eliminate them? Okay, so again, it's convert them and kind of make them ours. Okay, move them the heck out of the area, or guys, kill them. And that's as far thinking as it went. So we had kind of considered, I think, in some individual conversations with some students, what would have happened? What would uh, Native American culture look like today if some of the English attitude were different about these cultures when they met, about kind of learning from what if the early pattern of Native Americans and the English working together had carried it through. It's incredible how short-sighted and how limited the thinking is of the English here. There are a couple conflicts in particular that stand out that you should have run across if you went through the Gilder-Lehrman timeline. That's the Pequot War and King Philip's War. So the Indian tribes involved there in New England are, of course, the Pequots and the Wampanoags. Okay. Um, there is, as I said earlier, a little bit of a comparison to be made between what happens in New England and what happens down in the Chesapeake a little bit later. Just keep in mind, please, we're going to get to covering with some extensive detail what we will call Bacon's Rebellion out of the Chesapeake region that I mentioned earlier. Okay. But seeing as how the culture is very similar throughout the New England region, um, the English in these colonies formed the New England Confederation to defend themselves from against the natives, against the French, against the Dutch. Um, what we see here is a concept we're going to get to later called salutary neglect. salutary neglect. And I want you to pay attention to that term because it's absolutely going to play an important role. Again, seeds are being planted here. It's going to play an important role in eventually tensions rising, right, between the English and the colonists, the mother country English and the colonists in this new world. Because what salutary neglect is often like, hey, you just take care of your own. We can't be bothered. In the 1640s, the English were in a civil war, and they couldn't deal right with the colonies were an afterthought. So, in order, as I said, to provide a common defense against encroaching European nations like the French and the Dutch, or with the conflicts with respect to the Canadians, the New England Confederation forms. It's again another little seed being planted here. Okay, it sets a path towards colonial unity, and of course, when we talk about join or die and all that, any impending revolution that's going to take place doesn't take place without colonial unity. In response, and you'll see a pattern here, okay, the English eventually realized that, hey, the the New England region here, they're not the colonies, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, they're not following royal orders, especially, mind you, and this will repeat itself again, Massachusetts. So the colonies' charters are revoked by the throne, excuse me, and London creates the Dominion of New England. Um, and the colonists in New England are absolutely beside themselves. They are not pleased. That's also going to become a common theme. Okay, I think you know where we're going and how important Massachusetts and Boston is to the impending revolution, and I'll be getting on like this common theme of like when we go into that stage, right, which is really, by the way, the next time period 3. But again, seeds are being planted of like these ideas of like, hey, what pisses off the colonists so much that they just have to declare independence, and eventually that would happen, and you can see some of the seeds as early as well, the Dominion of New England. So that's the last lecture note I want to make. I would like to see if you guys can take your own little mental quiz over the videotape right now. See if you get some of these content questions accurately. Why did the Puritans settle in towns? They settled in towns because town meetings were important to the political and religious life of the Puritan settlers. You would eliminate probably question C there. But remember, if we're talking about like the Mayflower Compact, right, which is in New England, primarily separatist Puritans, right? That's direct democracy. So these town meetings, the idea of a town green, town halls, town meetings is very important. I'm going to give you a little example here. This is the town of Harvard, Massachusetts, where I was married. And if my mouse comes up, here's actually the church where I was married. No, I lied. Here is the church where I was married. And here is your town green in Harvard. And up the hill is the town hall. Or did I still get that backwards? I can't tell from this picture. But the idea is it's the same, is that in the New England region in particular, the idea of a congregated community was incredibly important culturally. Okay. Let's take a look at that in contrast to what we see in some of the southern colonies. What was an important consequence of the decision to colonize Virginia on counties instead of towns? Political and cultural institutions developed slowly because the population was spread out over a larger area. Now, part of that again is because Virginia is a major plantation colony. And so vast expanses of land are required for the farming of tobacco and cotton, and really in Virginia, primarily tobacco. Okay. Um, Virginia and the plantation colonies are thus develop to be much more rural regions. That plays a major role in these differences that we're going to see between the colonial regions that eventually is a seed planted for the Civil War, right? That industry takes off where we have towns, okay? It's an entirely different uh, economic structure in New England than it is in the South, where land is really important for an agrarian economy. Okay, vast amounts of land. The colonies end up organizing themselves on a county by county basis. There's no, none of these town halls. Yes, the Virginia House of Burgesses forms because a representative democracy would make more sense uh, in an area where you don't have all these towns. You have, right, a wider disbursement of the people. The Virginians, by the way, were definitely more vulnerable to Indian attack. The same would go for the Chesapeake region, and that's going to be part of the story when we get into Bacon's Rebellion. Okay, so hopefully you got those things right, or at least you kind of understand now. We talked about a lot, but again, I want you to keep in mind that generally speaking, we see cultural regions form between these three sections, right? New England, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies. And the cultures that form in those regions will have a major impact, a lasting impact on how those regions develop and how they feel about uh, government, uh, how they feel about slavery. Okay, but all in all, you're also going to see that there are seeds being planted long before we talk about seeds for the Civil War. We talk about seeds for the Revolutionary War. Okay, um, what I want you to do for homework moving forward here tonight is we are going to take a look at this essay, The Puritans and Dissent. I mentioned earlier the cases of Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. There is an essay on Gilder Lehrman. When you see this presentation posted in finals, in the Google Drive, you're actually going to have a link directly to. You can see if my mouse is showing up that this is hyperlinked on this slide. And you're going to get into an essay here. So that would be a secondary source. And what I'm going to ask you to do is read and analyze the cases of Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. So you're going to do a secondary source argument deconstruction. Here's your deconstruction template. I am going to put this assignment up on Google Classroom for you. Okay. So I want you to get into that work when you finish this lecture. If you finish this assignment on time, what can you do? You know what to do. You've got a choice board to do. Okay. So hopefully you got some good notes, maybe a little bit further understanding. I really like to talk about this era of history because, again, once we know how the story ends, we see how the seeds have been planted first for revolution and then for Civil War. And we'll talk more about that as we continue to move forward. Okay. So get into your Google Classroom to do your argument deconstruction secondary source analysis on Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, the essay from Gilder Lehrman. It's up on your Google Classroom. And when you're done with that, continue your ongoing work on your choice board with our textbook and with Howard Zinn. That is all I got for you today. Hope you guys are doing great. Thank you.